They say that some old files don't hold answers, only echoes. And among those echoes, few are as persistent as those surrounding the case known today by the region's most dedicated researchers as the disappearance of the widow of Hollowbrook and the 41 men who entered the Appalachian Mountains Basin and never returned. Before any page reveals what happened, the researcher responsible for reconstructing this case left a single simple sentence at the top of the original manuscript. Comment on which city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. He wrote this as if opening a silent door to the present, a discreet bridge between the reader and those who, in the long early mornings of 1890, witnessed the last trail of these men. The case begins in a forgotten part of the Appalachians, more precisely in the small and scattered community of Hollowbrook, which in the winter of 1890 had less than 200 inhabitants. It was a place where the wind sounded like a warning, where the river ran narrow and fast between dark rocks, and where every wooden house bore the marks of weather and time. There were no local newspapers. Everything that was known was transmitted by word of mouth, and everything that was not said weighed even more heavily. At the center of this setting was Eleanor Whitford, known to most as the widow of Hollowbrook. She was just over 35 when the case took shape, but her face, according to reports at the time, looked older, shaped by harsh weather and successive losses. Her husband had died 8 years earlier, in circumstances that were never fully clarified, and since then she had lived alone in a small house off the main road, surrounded by woods that no one liked to cross. Some said that Eleanor did not seek company, and others said the opposite, that it was company that did not seek Eleanor. The records are unanimous on one point. She was reserved, tough, extremely practical, and capable of surviving alone in an environment where even experienced men struggled to remain. Most commented that she knew more about the land than any man there, especially about roots, plants, and herbs used as medicine. This reputation, which for some was a source of respect, for others was a source of fear. That same winter, 41 men, laborers and small farmers disappeared without warning while conducting makeshift excavations in the eastern basin, near the land where Eleanor's house cast its shadow. What unites the reports is a single coincidence. All of them, in the days before, had sought out the widow in search of a specific root, the so-called black root, used as a tonic and medicine for severe pain. A valuable item, rare and difficult to find in the mountains. Official documents are scarce, but some surviving letters describe how, in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the community had begun to notice something strange in the habits of those men. Small but insistent details that residents would remember for decades. Footsteps before dawn, flashlights roaming the woods for no reason, nighttime visits to the widow's house, and an even more disturbing pattern. They all seemed to harbor a kind of silent haste, as if they were looking for something they didn't want to share. When the archives reach the point of recording the first confirmed absence, the narrative begins to fold in on itself. No obvious traces, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest an escape or a collective accident, just a broken trail, an interrupted line between the last place they were seen and the underground region known to older people as the Root Cellar. A set of narrow caves, natural tunnels, and depressions hidden by vegetation. Part of the territory where Eleanor harvested her plants. It is here, at this exact point in the records, that the first detail officially considered anomalous appears. Among the notes from the 1890 investigation, a federal agent who spent only 3 days in Hollowbrook wrote, "It does not appear that these men simply disappeared. It seems that someone guided them to the place where they were last seen." This passage, isolated like a thorn in the middle of the report, marks the real beginning of the mystery. And this is precisely where this first block ends, where the silence of the archives weighs more than any testimony, and where the lonely figure of the widow of Hollowbrook begins to stand out as an essential part of this story. Not because there is any evidence, but because from this point on, all the surviving clues seem to revolve around her. To understand how 41 men could disappear without leaving any clear traces, the archives insist on returning to what existed before the silence: routine. It is in this setting of repetitive days, small agreements and almost invisible gestures that the story of Hollowbrook ceases to be just a police case and becomes a human portrait of a community in slow tension. In 1890, Hollowbrook was a handful of wooden houses along a dirt road that disappeared among the hills. There was a simple church, a narrow grocery store, a community barn, and a stone building that served as a warehouse and meeting room. Life there revolved around three forces: the unpredictable weather, hard work, and the absolute necessity of depending on each other to survive the winter. The men who disappeared were not outsiders. They were fathers, sons, brothers, men who attended the same Sunday services and participated in the same autumn harvests. Some worked in makeshift mines further up the road, where small deposits of coal and iron were mined with hand tools. Others tended small farms, combining agriculture, animal husbandry, and any extra work that came up in neighboring towns. The women maintained the silent cohesion of the place. They were the first to notice when someone's mood changed, arrived late, or spoke less at the table. Many years later, it was precisely these female memories, sometimes fragmented, sometimes repeated word for word, that allowed the researcher to piece together the outline of life in Hollowbrook in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. They woke up before sunrise, especially in late February and early March of that year. Winter had not yet bid farewell, but the thaw was beginning to appear at the edges of the river, opening dark cracks in the ice. The reports converge on one detail. This period was marked by a silent uneasiness among the men of the Basin. It was not fear, nor euphoria. It was more like anticipation, as if everyone were waiting for something they could not yet name. One of the names that comes up frequently is that of Nathaniel Harrow, one of the most respected men in the village. At 43, a widower with 2 teenage children, he had a reputation for almost rigid seriousness. Witnesses say that year, he seemed more tired than usual, as if he were carrying a thought he never spoke aloud. One night, at the grocery store table, he reportedly commented, without looking at anyone in particular, that the earth has not yet shown all it has to give. The seemingly banal phrase was mentioned by 3 different people in separate records, which made the researcher underline it more than once when rereading the notes. Another recurring name is that of Caleb Turner, younger, newly married, known for his willingness to take on any job that would earn him a few extra coins. According to several testimonies, it was he who first mentioned black root as a possibility for changing one's life. Not as a medicine, but as an opportunity for profit. An itinerant healer, passing through a town 2 days' journey away, reportedly commented that merchants in larger cities paid well for rare roots used in tonics and pharmacy formulas. At the time, it was just a conversation by the stove. In the subsequent reconstruction, this conversation became a starting point. It is at this point that the figure of Eleanor Whitford inevitably returns to the narrative. Although she lived in isolation, the widow was known for her mastery of the region's underground. Shallow caves, narrow passages, tunnels formed by centuries of infiltration and erosion. For most, these places were dangerous and useless. For her, they were a source of survival. Notes from a visiting professor who passed through Hollowbrook in 1887 record that Eleanor walked confidently where others refused to enter, as if she had memorized the invisible topography of the basin. In the months leading up to her disappearance, the flow of men to the widow's house increased. At first, they were occasional visits, justified by chronic pain, fevers, or difficult-to-treat wounds. Then they became more frequent, discreet, and, according to some reports, accompanied by whispered conversations at the back door. The dates rarely coincide, but the general pattern is always the same. Men who had previously hardly spoken to Eleanor began to seek her out insistently, often alone, often at night. A neighbor who lived some distance away reported seeing flashlights moving along the edge of the woods at unusual hours, between 3 and 4 in the morning, toward the area known as the Root Cellar. She couldn't say who the men were, but she noticed the pattern. The light would appear at one point on the road, disappear among the trees, and reappear much further down, near the depressions in the ground that marked the entrance to underground crevices. No one asked her to report this officially at the time. She herself, as she later wrote, thought she was seeing too much. In public, almost nothing was said. At meetings in the stone building, the predominant topics continued to be supplies, firewood, and road repairs. But in private letters, especially those sent to relatives in other locations, phrases appear that the researcher carefully highlighted. "They are digging where they shouldn't," wrote one woman to her distant sister. Another mentioned that her husband came home smelling of deep earth, as if he had been too far underground. In another letter, with no specific date, someone sums it up this way: "Here, men have begun to follow the earth more than reason." None of these excerpts, taken alone, prove anything. Together, however, they create a clear atmosphere. Hollowbrook had the impression that something was stirring beneath the apparent normality. Children noticed their parents' prolonged absence on certain days. Women noticed that some men had become more reserved, less inclined to share their plans. Longtime friends began to drift apart, as if they had entered into agreements they could not share with anyone else. Despite this, life had to go on. Sundays continued with the same sermon on prudence and faith. Community meals still took place, even with more controlled portions. The river flowed, the wind blew against the windows, and Eleanor's house remained there, motionless, a silent presence in the landscape. Some reports indicate that she was seen a few times returning from the woods, carrying more weight than she usually did, dragging burlap sacks and baskets covered with thick cloths. No one asked what was inside. In Hollowbrook, curiosity was a dangerous luxury and a social risk. One of the last weeks before the mass disappearance is vividly described in a statement taken 40 years later by a regional newspaper. A woman, now elderly, recalls that for 3 nights in a row, she heard an unidentifiable sound coming from the direction of the hollows behind the Whitford property. It was neither a scream nor a song. She describes it as a mixture of tools and human effort, muffled by distance and damp earth. She said she got out of bed and went to the window, but the darkness was so thick that nothing could be seen, only the sound, rhythmic, insistent, as if men were digging a path under something that should not be disturbed. Curiously, there are no reports of open conflict between the men involved. No fights were recorded, no formal complaints were made, and no explicit incidents related to the excavations were reported. What there is the opposite, a kind of pact of silence, a tacit agreement not to comment too much on that section of the basin. One of Nathaniel's sons, years later, stated that his father began to leave the house without his coat, even in the cold, as if the rush were greater than the weather. These are small details, almost ridiculous for an official investigation, but they are repeated in different versions and help to compose the psychological portrait of a group that was moving towards something they perhaps did not fully understand. Meanwhile, the widow kept to her own pace. She continued to sell simple preparations and dried roots. She responded with short sentences, avoided long conversations, and rarely attended church. There is no record of her participating in any important community meetings during that period. Her presence was more like a shadow than a central figure. Still, almost all witnesses are unanimous in stating that, at some point during those weeks, each of the 41 men had crossed Eleanor's path in one way or another, whether asking for medicine, inquiring about trails, or asking directly for black root. It is at this point that everyday life begins to take on a different shape. Nothing spectacular, nothing that stood out at the time, but in the subsequent reconstruction, the archives seem to point to a discrete convergence. Restless men, promises of profit from rare roots, nighttime forays underground, and a woman who knew every invisible curve of that natural labyrinth. At the end of the section dedicated to context, the researcher leaves a note in the margin, almost like a comment to himself. If we don't understand what they were looking for before they disappeared, we will never understand why they agreed to go as far as they were last seen. It is this question, hanging over Hollowbrook's seemingly ordinary routine, that sets the stage for the night when the 41 men left together for the last time. The official files state only one objective sentence about the night of the disappearance. They left together, shortly before dawn. But everything that matters, the reason, the gestures, the sounds, the looks, exists only in the gaps filled by later testimonies, many of them collected decades later, when memory had already taken on the texture of time. A letter found in 1919, written by one of Nathaniel Harrow's sons, describes what he witnessed on the last dawn he saw his father. He recounts waking up to the creaking of the front door and peering down the narrow hallway, seeing Nathaniel standing for a moment, holding the lamp as if waiting for some answer from the darkness outside. "He seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear," he wrote, "as if someone were already calling him." This detail, men waking before sunrise, as if summoned by something outside, appears repeatedly in the testimonies, not as a supernatural presence, but as a silent, almost economical human urgency, the feeling that, on that particular night, action was needed. They had to get there before others. They had to be there while the earth was still cold and quiet. A neighbor's notes indicate that, around 3:40 a.m., she saw 2 flashlights moving along the main road, heading east toward the woods surrounding the Whitford property. Soon after, other lights joined in, at a pace she describes as organized but without obvious leadership. And yet, everyone walked as if they already had a common goal: the underground routes. Years later, the researcher drew up an approximate map based on these descriptions. It shows a row of men walking in silence, some carrying improvised tools, others just ropes or burlap sacks. The cold must have been biting, but almost no one wore heavy coats. It was as if urgency had been greater than preparation. At the top of the hills, the sky was beginning to lighten with a pale blue, but in the basin, the darkness was still dense, muffled by the presence of trees and the moisture rising from the ground. Their footsteps led the group to the edge between the woods and the area of depressions in the ground that marked the entrances to the underground. Some of these crevices were wide enough to allow 2 men to enter side by side. Others required crawling. In later reports, a geologist described that region as an unstable labyrinth formed by centuries of infiltration, partial collapses, and narrow channels that accumulated on top of each other. For most inhabitants, it was forbidden territory. For Eleanor Whitford, it was part of everyday life. Curiously, however, there is no record that the widow was present that night. No witness claims to have seen her among the group. No letter mentions her silhouette. No subsequent claim places her there, not even among the most exaggerated rumors. If she was present in any way, the archives have been unable to prove it. What is known is that, at the edge of the clearing, the men paused briefly. There is no description of conversation, discussion, or disagreement. Nothing. Only silence. The kind of silence that precedes a decision already made. The neighbor who watched from afar describes that, for a few moments, the lanterns remained motionless, all pointed at the same spot, a narrow hole, partially covered by roots, in a sloping depression in the ground. This spot, now destroyed by time and subsequent landslides, was known to only 2 people according to records: a hunter who left the region 10 years earlier and Eleanor Whitford. The hunter, interviewed in 1905, claimed to remember the place only as a hole that breathed, a poetic and disturbing description, but one that, according to him, referred to the fact that warm air sometimes rose from the depths below, especially at dawn. Why would 41 men, some of them experienced and sensible, choose to enter there before sunrise? This is the question that the researcher repeats several times in the manuscript, as if he himself was searching for an explanation that never came. There is speculation. Some letters mention the promise of finding large quantities of black root in that area, perhaps enough to change the economic fate of many. Some say that Caleb Turner had found a new, unexplored crevice and promised that there, the root grew like wild vines. There is no confirmation, there are no maps. There are no concrete traces. What there is, however, is what came next. The first to enter were Caleb and Nathaniel, followed by 6 other men carrying ropes and shovels. Witnesses who saw the lanterns in the distance said that the light dimmed little by little, as if the group was slowly being swallowed by the darkness underground. The sound of the first descents was described as dry metal against stone, accompanied by muffled murmurs, men coordinating steps, adjusting lamps, pulling ropes. One of these sounds, captured in one of the letters, is particularly vivid. It sounded as if the earth was being pushed away from them, as if they were clearing a path where there should be no path. At some point, just before dawn, a final group of men approached the entrance. The neighbor, watching from afar, says she saw a brief hesitation, as if some were unsure, but were pulled along by the decision of the others. It may have been just fatigue or cold. It may have been something simpler. No one wanted to be the only one to return home empty-handed. But there is one detail that marks this exact moment. The neighbor wrote that, for a fraction of a second, she saw someone standing further up among the trees, just a silhouette, rigid, motionless, as if observing the movement below. There is no name. There is no identification. Just the image of someone who did not react to the scene, but only watched. The researcher, analyzing this testimony, noted on the side, "It could be anyone, but the witness's silence seems more revealing than her memory. When the last man came down, the flashlights disappeared from view. From that moment on, no clear noise is recorded, no echo of tools, no exchange of voices, no calls for help. What is described in almost all subsequent reports is the opposite, a deep, thick silence, as if the underground had closed the door behind them. Around 6 in the morning, the sky cleared completely. The neighbor, afraid of being seen, returned inside her house. The river began to thaw. The road remained empty, and none of the lanterns shone again in the woods. At 8 in the morning, one of the wives, according to the record, realized that her husband had not returned. At 11, others began to ask questions. By noon, Nathaniel, Caleb, and all the others were officially missing. The researcher's reconstruction ends this section with the last known evidence. A worn rope found 3 days later, attached to a thick root at the edge of the depression. There were no signs of cutting, no sudden break, no marks that it had been pulled back. The rope was simply there, intact, motionless, pointing to a dark void where 41 men had entered, and none of them ever returned. At first, the absence of the 41 men was treated as a delay. The Appalachian Basin was unpredictable, and no one was surprised when groups took longer than expected to return from excavations or forays into difficult areas. But as the hours passed and the sun crossed halfway across the sky without a single figure appearing on the road, unease began to spread from house to house. Around 2 in the afternoon, the women gathered in small groups in front of the grocery store. Some wore tightly tied aprons, others held still warm metal cups in their hands. Preserved accounts described their gazes, steady, tense, as if each expected the other to say that everything was fine. But no one did. At 4 o'clock, a group of 4 older men, those who had not participated in the raid, decided to go to the woods. One of them was Elias Granger, owner of the community stable, known for his almost exaggerated prudence. In a statement recorded in 1902, he wrote, "I didn't feel brave enough to go deeper. But even on that first walk, I realized that something was wrong in the air, as if the woods had fallen silent to listen to us." It is just a poetic phrase, but emotionally consistent with what many described that day. A lack of sounds. No birds, no breaking branches, no wind rustling through the tallest leaves. The silence began to weigh heavily. When they reached the depressions in the ground, the men found only recent footprints and the same rope that days later would be catalogued as official evidence. The entrance to the crevice was intact, with no obvious signs of slippage, but there was no echo, no response, not even the damp smell that normally came from underground cavities. It was as if the air had been sucked into a void that no one could name. The search began that same afternoon. Flashlights were lit. Rocks were moved. Ropes were tied to thick logs. Some of the younger men descended a few meters, as far as possible without risking their lives, and returned with the same answer. Total darkness. No traces. No fallen tools. No human sounds coming from the depths. That first night, the entire community stayed awake. The second night brought reinforcements from 2 neighboring towns. A federal agent was sent to the site 3 days later, but his presence brought discomfort, not relief. He noted in his field notebook that the community seemed to be hiding something they preferred not to say. But at the same time, he admitted that he found no reason for such an impression, just hard, exhausted looks and a natural distrust of any outside authority. The search lasted 5 days, and at the end of the 5th day, for the first time in Hollowbrook's history, the word disappearance ceased to be a risk and became a certainty. But the investigation did not stop there. What followed was less a formal process and more a desperate attempt to make sense of what had no apparent explanation. The figure of Eleanor Whitford would emerge as a fixed point in this effort. The widow was questioned twice. The first time she said little. She said she had not seen any flashlights that night. She said she had not heard any footsteps. She said she had spent the night preparing dried medicines. There are no records of a hostile tone, but there are repeated passages that indicate discomfort. On the investigator's second visit, Eleanor stated only that the men were looking for more than the land could give. When asked what she meant by that, she fell silent. That silence fueled rumors. Years later, some women in the community said that Eleanor began to avoid going to the grocery store. Others said she looked thinner, as if she had spent nights without sleep. And there is another curious note. One of the sons of the missing men wrote that one day he saw the widow standing by the side of the road, staring intently in the direction of the crevices, not with fear, but with an expression he described as the weariness of someone who knows more than she wants to admit. But no concrete evidence was found against her, and all speculation lost strength in the face of a simple question. Why would Eleanor, a woman alone, lead 41 men into an underground crevice? The federal investigator concluded in his final report, there is insufficient evidence to suggest bad faith on the part of Mrs. Whitford. Even so, Eleanor's fate was marked by the case. In the months that followed, she became even more isolated. It was whispered that she had stopped gathering roots in the Depression area, something she had done since before her husband's death. Some said they heard doors slamming in her house in the early hours of the morning, as if she were walking restlessly around the property. Others said that the widow had started burning papers, including old notebooks she had kept for years. None of this was proven, but all of it was said. Meanwhile, Hollowbrook was wasting away. Without a husband, without a father, without a brother, without physical support for the work, several families began to depend on the church and their neighbors. The following winter was severe, and only half of the fields were planted in the spring of 1891. The children grew up hearing the story as a warning, not of monsters, not of spirits, but of the earth itself, which sometimes swallowed what was taken from it without permission. But the most human and hardest part of the file appears 23 years later in an interview with the Charleston newspaper, where one of the wives, then elderly, said, "It wasn't the earth that took our men, it was ambition." And that seemingly simple phrase became the interpretive axis for many later scholars, not because it solved the case, but because it accurately conveyed what had been perceived in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Men who sought too much, who dug too much, who believed they could find wealth where, for generations, only risk had been found. The remains of the main depression began to crumble around 1907. The original entrance disappeared after a landslide. In 1911, a storm destroyed part of the area, completely closing off the remaining access points. Over time, Hollowbrook stopped trying to find answers. The absence became part of the landscape. At the end of this section of the manuscript, the researcher wrote, in the last line, a reflection that the residents never read. What disappears is not only what is missing, it is also what remains in the memory of those who stayed. And it is precisely this memory, laden with silence and unanswered questions, that leads the story to its final chapter. Decades later, when Hollowbrook no longer appeared on smaller maps, and the old dirt road had been swallowed up by tall grass and twisted roots, The case of the 41 missing persons still troubled scholars and residents scattered throughout neighboring towns. The silence persisted, not because of a lack of reports, but because each new detail discovered seemed only to open the door to more questions. The researcher responsible for reconstructing this archive, the same one who left at the top of the manuscript the phrase asking the reader to say which city they were watching from, spent 20 years piecing together pieces that never quite fit together. What he found was not a clear answer, but rather a constellation of human fragments, misaligned memories, letters written by lamplight, weary testimonies, inaccurate maps, hand-drawn sketches, notes from traveling doctors, school records, lists of debts, and above all, silences. He traveled the basin for 3 seasons, walking the same stretches where the lanterns had been seen that dawn. He visited descendants, collected objects left behind in houses, faded photographs, pewter cutlery, leather notebooks with notes on harvests, and with each new conversation, he realized that Hollowbrook had fallen apart around that absence, as if the village had never been able to continue, only survive in the memory of those who had left. The figure of Eleanor Whitford, the widow of Hollowbrook, persisted as a shadow in this process. With no accurate records of her death, no direct witnesses to her final years, she became part of local myth. Some versions say she left the region discreetly one spring dawn. Others claim she died there alone and was buried in a field without a cross, as was the custom for those who had no close relatives. The researcher, upon revisiting her abandoned home, found only what time could not carry away: a tilted chair, a broken shelf, a clay pot smelling of ancient roots, and a thick cloth still attached to the nail on the door. Nothing that told a story, just traces of someone who lived on the edge between the necessary and the bearable. In the final pages of the manuscript, he writes that, during his walks through the basin, he could feel that the underground was still there, invisible, untouched, deep. But, unlike his first investigations, he did not go down, not because he was afraid of what he might find, but because he understood that there was nothing left to look for there. The earth had already absorbed everything: tools, footsteps, ambitions, efforts, decisions, and human errors. Nothing that could be recovered now would bring back the men who entered that crevice before dawn in 1890. Interviews with descendants reveal another important detail, perhaps the most human of all. The community never believed that there was a single culprit. They did not attribute everything to the widow, nor to greed, nor to nature, nor to chance. Most simply said that some choices weigh more when you look back than when you make the decision. This type of phrase, dry, direct, resigned, is all that remains of many families in the region. In recent years of research, the chronicler began to reflect that the case persisted not because of the strangeness of the facts, but because of their absence. The mystery was not in the underground entrance, nor in the sounds, nor in the lanterns. It was in the emptiness that followed. What impressed him most was not the literal darkness of the crevices, but the emotional darkness left on the surface, in the unplanted fields, in the doors that never slammed again, in the beds that remained made for decades. On one of his last trips to Hollowbrook, now an old man, he stood alone at the edge of the former depression, now just a timid mound of moss-covered earth. The wind carried a faint smell of damp wood, and the landscape seemed so far removed from 1890 that it was hard to imagine that so many lives had ended there. Even so, he noted that as he stood there, he had the uncomfortable feeling that this place did not hold a secret. It held a weight that no longer belonged to the community, but to memories that stubbornly survived time. By studying what is missing, he wrote in his final notebook, we discover much more about those who stayed than about those who left. It was this awareness, bitter but true, that closed the file. On the last page, before closing the manuscript, he wrote a reflection that was not intended for courts, newspapers, or authorities, but for the reader who reached the end. Hollowbrook was never about 41 absences. It was about everything no one could say after they were gone. And with that, the account ends. As most real stories end, not with a conclusion, but with silence, a silence that remains.